Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. It's wonderful to host you again on another conversation. Definitely to be your host again. And so wherever I'm excited you're here with us today. I'm your host with Chigozie George. My name is Chigozie George, as you all already know. So a moment to face joy that with us this morning. So if it's morning wherever you're joining us, good morning. If it's evening, good evening to the conversation today. So for those who've been joining us for a long months or 3 months of conversation, and you've and questions, and thank you all for your feedback. We do really appreciate it. Today, in with an inspiring person, someone who came across him to with him. It's wonderful. He's supportive and it's a very learned person, and again a very strategic person. He was my counselor every time I have issues. Speak with him, and he has this calm voice, foreign voice. So it's going to be a wonderful conversation with him today. So you're joining us in today that you are in for a inspiration. There's a lot of knowledge to take from it. So I want to encourage you to sit enjoy the conversation. So what might welcome you to share and invite your friends. I welcome you to, send a link to your friends on Facebook, on there. So thank you so much. I'm going to quickly something I'm going to allow Dr. Mitch to quickly do a little bit of introduction of himself so that get a little background from him on why you have that. All right, so thank you so much. Welcome to our conversation, Dr. Mitch. It's a pleasure to have you here, sir.
Thank you, George. It's a joy to be here. I bring greetings to everyone. So grateful you're able to join us this morning and have just a chance to sit around the table and chat a little bit about some of the things that are going on in the region and in the area. As George mentioned, my name is Mitch Hamilton. My wife Teresa and I, we live in Morocco. And for the past 10 years, we have spent our time doing work among migrating people, moving people. For 30 years prior to that, I served as a minister in the United States. And in each of the urban contexts in which we worked, we had a large population of people who had come from somewhere else. In our fellowship, we might hear anywhere from 10 to 12 languages in our services, but in our community, in the homes, there was registered over 115 different languages being spoken in the homes around us. And so in our community of Denver, Colorado, we had a large population of moving people. And so our work there in Denver transitioned to work in West Africa and North Africa, trying to understand how migration was happening, what are the dynamics that surround migration, and what are the best ways that the community who is receiving migrants can best serve their new neighbors and care for the people that have been brought into their community. And so that gave me a wonderful opportunity to meet George and his sweet wife and to just have a chance to learn from them and to become friends with them and colleagues with them in this work of just understanding the world around us and understanding how to best help our neighbors not just come into a community and survive, but how to help them come into their new home and their new community and to thrive in that context. And so George, it's a joy to be here with you and to be with your folks this morning. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. I had this 100 over 100 languages spoken. That is beautiful. One of the greatest privileges of my life. This we have sometimes we have people from over 50 in one gathering. Always been beautiful. How is it, before we get into the whole conversation, how is it like meeting people first all over the world, so many people from different countries in one gathering? How how do you navigate the cultures, the different US when you have all of these people from different diverse cultures integrate? How do you get that as someone who has to connect all of them?
Well, honestly, it's not that difficult. If you look at this from an academic perspective, it becomes challenging. If you look at this from a political perspective, it becomes challenging. But when you sit across the table from someone, it's person to person, human being to human being, family to family, father to father. And what you find
Hmm.
is that people have all the same heart, they have the same desire. They want what is best for their family, they want what is best in their community. They may be
Hmm.
struggling with culture or context, but you have to understand in America, America is a big country. If you move from one side of the country to another, you're struggling with culture and context because it's very different,
Hmm.
even in the United States. And so, what you find when you sit across the table with people is that they're just people, and relationships
Yeah,
build. And when relationships build, you discover that you have a lot to contribute to one another. And so, as long as we can keep it on a relational level, things go very smoothly, go easily, actually. And so, at that level, it's not that hard.
that's good. It's important that you mentioned that when we sit across the, understand that it's just people, and people needs and all most of our needs are basically the same. It's very, I think it's very important that we all understand that. Thank you so much. I feel like I feel like before I we get into the whole conversation, I feel like I want to ask you something very trivial. Uh, you've traveled many countries. I know about this before. Asking, where have you had the best meal, the best dish? Which
Oh, my
country?
stars. There is nothing, there is nothing that can compare with a good yassa poulet in Senegal. It
Oh,
just, I've eaten a lot of things in a lot of places. Some of them were good, some of them were not so good. But give me a good yassa, and I'm a happy person.
Senegalese people. Hope you heard that. I never tried that before, but I'm definitely out for it. I'm from
Uh,
Senegal. It's something beautiful.
if you haven't had yassa poulet, you've missed out.
Okay, I'm definitely going to. So let me. You've been into leadership for more than 40 years. I have conversation with you, meet you in person. Leadership, you know, abilities. You're very humble. I see that you've led from a place of understanding people and trying to meet their needs, serve them. Ask, what are the characteristics that distinguish successful leaders, the leaders in different spectrum that distinguish them, sir?
Well, when we talk about leaders, we always have to think of it in two terms. We have to think first in who they are, and then we have to think second in what they
Hmm.
do. Most of the time, when you pick up material on leadership, you listen to people talk about leadership. It always seems to be about the doing side. A leader does this, a leader does that. Uh, the challenge with that is every context is different. And so what you might do in one context is different in another context. So if you begin the conversation with what leaders do, then you generally have no foundation upon which to base your commentary or your guidance. If,
Okay.
however, you begin the conversation with who leaders are, the being part of them, who they are on the inside, what characterizes their lives, then suddenly you have a foundation in which the doing will occur naturally. And so,
Mm,
leaders are people of character.
mm,
Leaders are the kind of people that when other people see them, they know that they are honest people. They know that they are
mm,
people who do things in a just way. They can trust them. They can put their faith in them. They may not agree with the
mm,
decisions they make. They may not even say I would have done it the way they did it, but they don't question the character. They don't question the heart. And so we often talk about leadership is about character building. People of poor character do not make good
mm,
leaders. People of
mm,
good character will find that, and remember, a leader is not about someone who leads, it's about someone that people will follow. And so people don't like to follow people of bad character. They want to follow people who have good character. Now, obviously,
mm,
character is not all there is in the question. There also has to be some level of competency. A leader has to be able to know and understand the context in which they are living and in which they're serving, and they have to be able to competently lead. If I have a doctor, I want a doctor who has character, but I also want a doctor
mm,
that is competent. Um, a good guy does not
mm,
make a good surgeon. In the same way,
mm,
a good woman does not necessarily make a great leader. I may want to follow them because of their character, but they need to understand and know their trade. They need to understand their skill. And that oftentimes comes by experience, comes through training, which is why leadership develops over time. Young people may have really good character, but if they don't have any experience, then they're on the front end of the leadership curve, not the back end of the leadership curve. And so this thing of competence, this things of character, and then there's a third part that is just critical in my mind. And these have to be people who care about people. These are people who have compassion. Someone who's a good person, someone who knows their trade really well, doesn't mean people will follow them. People have to understand that that person genuinely cares about. I'm going to follow someone who cares about me. I'm going to follow someone who cares about my career, to someone who cares about my
mm,
family, who cares about my circumstance, and is willing to take all that into consideration as a part of the decisions that are being made. Now, the truth of the matter is, it's hard to find all three things in one person at the same time. We're all on a journey, and we're all building our own character. We know our character flaws, so does everyone else, and we're working to be better at those. We know what we know, but
mm,
we don't know what we don't know. And so we're constantly learning how to do what we do better. And let's face it, we do well with people that we like. We do well with people who are like us. We struggle with people who are contrary. We struggle with people who bring conflict. We struggle with people who are critical. We struggle with people who do not have character, or we struggle with people who do
mm,
not have competence. Leaders want to lead people who have character. Leaders want to lead competent people. In a perfect world, that would be there, but it's not a perfect world. So, as leaders, you have to have compassion, you have to have care, you have to have patience, you have to be able to work with people. And when people sense that you can do that, then they're going to follow you. Uh, and so, uh, leadership is more than just, okay, have this meeting, have that meeting, say these things, don't say those things, have a goal, have a structure, have objectives, evaluate. Those all fall into the process. but those are really much smaller components. The more important components have to do with who you are, not so much with what you do.
I think that almost every leader or someone in a position that I have had this class of 3 months, every one of you alluded to and competence. That means it is very important that leaders and competence. Leaders must know what they are doing in that particular or in the particular leaders. So, and the third one, if I'm correct, people that people don't care what you know until they know that you care. So it is important what anybody knows. It's not important to know if I cannot people that I care don't care about I
Mm-hmm.
know. So I just work in terms of compassion. Leaders must first of all show that they care. The people care about what leaders know. So thank you so much. I want to talk about on individual basis on what can you say is something that success on individual basis that is as a nation is successful and not full, but on individual basis because there may be people there are people listening who are not a leader. I'm not in leadership position in my work. I'm not a staff. What can someone say? I'm successful because when you so platforms have their own definition of success. Screaming at our faces, people feel like people are frustrated when they look at the lives of all themselves with us. You know, the things that can correct around.
You know, my wife and I live and work an awful lot in North Africa and in a lot of these old urban contexts. You know, the old urban center was the Medina, and Medinas today are characterized by buildings. They're not real tall, 2 or 3 stories at the most, but very narrow streets, very narrow alleyways. And so it's easy to get lost in a Medina. You can get back in those things, and if you're not a resident, you won't know where you're going. I always try to imagine, how do you determine success in a world where it's
Mhm,
so easy to get surrounded by narrow streets and high walls? Most people, particularly early in their careers, they're putting a ladder up against a wall and they're climbing the ladder. The problem is you don't even know if the ladder's leaning up against the right wall.
mhm,
You won't even know that till you get to the top and you can look around a little bit. And while you're climbing that ladder of your career or of your whatever particular position you're in today, you don't know if you're supposed to be climbing it quickly or if you're supposed to be climbing it slowly. You don't know
mhm,
if somebody's going to come around the corner on a moto and knock the ladder out from under you. You don't know any of that. You just know that you're in this place. There's a ladder leaning against the wall, and you've been told to climb the ladder. And so you can't get away from that. That's just called life. But what I encourage people
mhm,
to do is, if you base your success upon whether or not you get to the top of the ladder, that's a risky maneuver, because you very well may get to the top of the ladder and discover you're on the wrong wall. And you spend a lot of time and energy climbing a ladder going not where you want to go. Life is full of climbing ladders, climbing back down the ladders, leaning on against a different wall, climbing that ladder. And then one day, when you get older, you find out that you have mastered the ladder and the wall, but in so doing, you've missed a lot of things that were more important. There's a lot of things in this world that we don't know, and we pursue those. We have to. It's not like you get an option. You have to be employed. You have to have work. You have to take care of your family. You have to do those things. But there's a lot of unknowns in that. And if you focus on the unknowns, you're always going to be a person who is struggling to feel like you're successful. On the other hand, there are a lot of things that are known. There are a lot of things that are certain. They're certain today, and they're going to be certain tomorrow, and they're going to be certain at the end of your life. For example, your family. Your family is one of those things that's certain. If you've been blessed to have a wife or a husband and to have children, those are certain things. Those are the things that you know you can pour yourself into, and that success will
Mm-hmm.
come through that. Success can come in that. I have met a lot of people who are very successful in climbing ladders, but when they got to the end of their life, nothing about that ladder or that job or that wall meant very much to them. What meant the most to them was
Mm-hmm.
their spouse, their children, their grandchildren. And the problem was they did not put any effort into making that part of their life successful. And so they may have succeeded in making money or building a career, but they failed in the things that were more important. So look around you and ask yourself, what are the things in my life that are important, that will be important in 30, 40, 50, 60 years? And invest yourself in those things. Your relationships, relationship with your family, relationship with friends, your relationship with God, your faith. Those are the kinds of things that when the day is done, success matters. Uh, there are a lot of things in this world that the world is chasing, social media is chasing, and says this makes you successful. But you talk to any one of those people who actually was successful in that area 20 years from now, and they will tell you how empty that was and how easy you can waste an awful lot of time chasing things that bring no satisfaction. And so I encourage people,
Mm-hmm.
you have to go to work every day. You have to climb the ladder. And oftentimes it's a ladder not of your choosing, but you don't have to put everything into it. You can save
Yeah.
the best of who you are for the best of the things that God has given you.
Hmm. But, you make the statement, people need to learn to focus on what is important. In this time, people actually, you know, like, I don't, how many people actually consider to be, very important to them. A lot of people are thinking, my work is the most important. My work is everything. But it's the things that are still the things that are important. I don't know. I'm trying to find the best way to frame the question, such as to find out what I or thing and say this is because I know family is important. What about what is important? Hello, sir.
Let's make sure
Okay.
we still, yeah, let's make sure we still have good audio.
Got
Um, George, it's a hard question. I've known a lot of people that I respect very greatly, and they will tell you that they've had seasons of their life when they had abundance. You have that time when you're in the
it.
perfect job and everything is just going well. You've got great health. You seem to have enough money to do anything you want to do. I've known a lot of people who had wealth, and they'll tell you, I've known the days when everything went well. And when things are going well, it's hard to know what's important because there's so many things happening around you. When job is going well, you lose the ability to say what's more important, job or people. When there's money in the bank, It's hard to say what's more important, the money in the bank or the people. Where you learn what is
mm,
important is not in the times of abundance, but it's in the times of lacking, it's in the times of suffering. Uh, when someone is struggling with a serious illness, the amount of money in the bank doesn't matter to them anymore. When someone is
mhm,
struggling with, when they've lost their job and they don't know how they're going to eat, for them, suddenly, other things that, going out for the weekend is not nearly as important to them anymore. When their child is sick, and they realize that my child is really, really hurting, really, really sick, maybe in danger of losing their life. It's amazing how many things that you used to think were important just fall off the scale and you don't talk about them at all. It's in the times of difficulty where you're able to truly focus on that which is important. Everyone goes through ups and downs. Everyone has good days, everyone has bad days. I encourage people, when you're in the bad days, when times are hard, that's the best time to identify the things that are most important to you. And the challenge in life is how to hold on to that when the days get better. How to hold on to the priority of
mm,
your family when your job does get good. How to hold on to the priority of the family when you go from being barely able to buy groceries to having enough money to go eat out at a restaurant if you want to. How to hold on to the priorities and the disciplines of life of in the abundance that you learned when things are tough. A practical example: if you don't have much money, you learn how to budget the money that you have. If there's not much money coming in, you make sure you set aside money to buy groceries, you set aside money to pay the rent, you set aside money to take care of things that have to be taken care of, and you stop spending on all the things that don't really matter. But it's amazing how many
mhm,
people who learned those disciplines when they were poor, and then when they became rich, they forgot those disciplines and they start spending in an extravagant lifestyle and they never continue saving. They don't learn how to budget their money. And then when the hard times come again, they're back in trouble again. And they actually, had they maintained the disciplines of a good budget when times were good, they would have had plenty of money when times went bad again, but they don't do that. I
mhm,
encourage people, when times are hard, that's the best time to learn what should be the priorities of your life, and
mm.
discipline yourself to maintain that when the times get better.
The thing is, people, when things go good for them, like where they forget what was important, they forget when things were rough. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why people then eventually they forget the basic principles that laid the foundation of what they have become today.
Hmm.
Principles,
Hmm.
you know. And I say this to people, whatever position you are right now, anyone may be right now, it is very, very truly ask yourself, just as Dr. said, what is going to be 30 years? I think that's what he said, 30, 40 years down the line, what's going to be important to me, going to be there for me. Just like he said, when you're sick, who is going to be there for you? When you're down and out, who's going to be there with you? What's going to be most? These are the things that you need to pay attention to. But while it's important that you also pay attention to the rest of the things happening in your life, but as I'm out, when I'm ill, I'm when I'm when I'm stressed, or when things are not going, who can I look up to? Who's going to be the things that are really important? And such kind of people are people that you ought to pay attention to. Say confidently that when I went through some of the crashes my own life, which I've shared with Dr. Mitch, I felt so alone. People that I had looked up You know, were verbally there for me. It's like saying we support you, but we support. It's
Mhm.
like we're there for you, but we're there for you. Get mixed up, and we don't want to get mixed up. We be tarnished by, but we support from afar. It's important that you always ask who a mix of who's going to be through. And I had my made understand the important family conversation with my siblings over and over. You know your family. You know the for you when things ain't going well. When it seems to be like your life is, that's when you know who's your family. Honestly, there's this story. There's this proverb we say in Nigeria that when someone is dead, the cup. That's when you know who are the family members
Mm.
because we come and pick up the cups when it's decayed and smelling and abandoned in the street. Maybe someone will come. So it's important that we find out what's important with you if in your life, what's going to be important in the next years, and stick with it. Thank you, sir. Now, over conversation, you've mentioned your wife, in every question there's your wife, and I've met your wife. You are a great couple. The relationship, the dynamics of your relationship. I feel like I'm gonna ask, just like every other person wanted to. What are your tips for a successful home? What are your tips?
Well, Teresa and I have had the privilege of being married now 42 years. We started dating when we were just teenagers, so that was 45 years ago. And so we've been
Wow.
around each other an awful lot, and through good times, through hard times. I remember I was sharing with you, George, one time that when we first got married, there was an older couple that came to our church, and they had been married over 70 years. They were in their 90s,
Wow.
and I remember asking the husband, Mr. Grimes. I remember asking him what was the secret to a long and happy marriage. And he told me two things. He said, first, he said, always open the door for your wife. Always be the gentleman. Always publicly put her first. Always take care of her. And then he said, and the second thing is a little bit more practical. He said, anytime you go to a restaurant, let her order anything on the menu that she wants to order. If she wants to order the most expensive thing on the menu, you let her order. Let her make the choice of what she's going to eat at that restaurant, and you don't look at the price. And I said, but what if I can't afford everything on the menu?
Okay.
What if there's things on that menu I just can't afford? And he laughed. He said, then you should have taken her to a different restaurant. Um, the truth of the matter, the truth of the matter is, in every relationship, there are things that you have the ability to control and things that you do not have the ability to control. In every relationship, things happen. And some of the things you cause, some of the things you're responsible for, and some of the things are just purely circumstantial. And then some of the things are what because the other person who's also in the relationship. One of the things I remind people about relationships is that they are always very personal. They have to be transparent. They have to be open. And in the same way that leadership requires a bit of character, relationships require character. And the truth of the matter is, your spouse will see your character. They will know who you are. And they count on that because every marriage is a relationship. All relationships are based on trust, and marriage is one of those most intimate trust. and trust is based on the character of the person you're in a relationship with. And so they're seeing that. So you're always building your character. Competency is a big part of that. If we want to apply that to the marriage, uh, it's real possible to do some really foolish things in your marriage that just demonstrate you're not very competent at relationship building, relationship maintaining. Um, and then, the whole compassion thing. You're in the relationship because you love each other, and there has to be that level of compassion and care. Ultimately, however, strong relationships are always built on a commitment. You've made a commitment to one another, and the strength of that commitment will be tested by the trials and the circumstances of life. And so I always tell people marriage is
Mm.
kind of like it's kind of like a cookie jar. When you come into the relationship, this cookie jar's got some cookies in it. I call it the cookie jar of trust. And so when you come in, there's always some cookies in that jar. If there weren't, you wouldn't get together to begin with. And so she trusts
Mhm.
you, he trusts her, just coming in from the very beginning. Well, once you get into the marriage, everything you do either puts cookies in the jar or takes cookies out. And of course, your goal is to always put cookies in the jar because things are going to happen that are going to take them out.
Yeah.
And what you're working to do over the years is to build a good, solid bank of trust in that jar. That
Mhm.
way, if something
Bang.
happens, you do something foolish, one of your character flaws reveals itself. There comes a day when love is not the emotion of the day, then the jar has enough trust in it to sustain those deficits, those hard times. People get foolish if they let that jar get real low, and they're not constantly putting things into the jar to build the trust. And so if you let it get too low, then you're at a risk because all it takes is one event and suddenly the jar is completely empty. And the problem is if you ever lose trust completely, it becomes very difficult to rebuild. And so for me, the kind of the key to a good long relationship is you're just constantly doing things to build that jar of trust in one another, so that when the hard times come, and they always do, but when the hard times come, you have enough of a reserve in that relational jar of trust to sustain that. And if you do, then your commitment's going to hold strong, and 1 year turns into two, and two turns into 20, and 20 turns into 40. And at the end, what you realize is that was success. That was worth investing in. I've had a lot of jobs in my life. I've done a lot of things in my world, but I'm going to tell you the thing that brings me the greatest joy, and the thing that if I'm going to be successful at, I want it to be my marriage, because that's the one thing that has endured all things.
Well, you've been years, and I'm gonna ask the question. Interesting, not boring. You know, for 42 years,
Well,
because it's like it's like having um a television station in your house. Choose to watch one station. Years, interesting, not boring for 42 years.
my first response would be change the channel every once in a while. Sometimes, sometimes life changes the channel for you. Life is different when you're before you get married than after you get married. It's a whole new world that you have to
Hmm.
adjust to. And then when children
Hmm.
come, if you're privileged to have children, then that changes things. And of course, children growing up is always a change. And then when the children leave home, suddenly now your world changes once again. And so there's always change in life. There's always change in my life, in my wife's life, career change, all kinds of things. For us, after 30 years, we took on an entirely new role that took us from the United States to Africa. And we have spent the last 10 years doing what we do in Africa and traveling around the Mediterranean. Well, that is constantly changing the channel, constantly changing the channel. I'd say the other thing is we're constantly learning about one another. Um, I ask young couples sometimes, how well do you think you know each other? On a scale of 1 to 10, where 0 is you don't know each other at all, and 10 is you know each other better than God knows you. And I'll ask these young couples, and they'll oftentimes say, "Oh, we're probably a 6 or a 7. I know her pretty good. I know him pretty good." And I tell people that after 42 years, I'm probably at a 2 with my wife. She is such a wonderful, complex creation of God that I could spend an entire lifetime with her and just scratch the surface of who she is. And so marriage is about this journey of discovery of one another. And every day I'm learning new things about her. And she's learning new things about me. And so things never become a rerun. It's not like watching a channel where you've seen the same program 100 times. We get up every day, and yeah, it's a familiar channel and it's a familiar context, but there's new things happening every day that are always, and you get to choose. You can either say, I'm going to embrace those new things and we're going to enjoy these new things together, or you can say, no, I'm going to become individualistic and egocentric and I'm going to leave the other person out. If you choose that second pathway, you're not going to have a good relationship for very long. If you choose the former, every day is going to be fresh and exciting.
It's important that you said change the channel from time to time, do something different, you know. And it's also amazing when you've been married for only know in terms of knowing you're just on a 2 pointer. That is that is not what I would say. I would say, okay, I know her pretty well. I know her pretty well. So then I should think though, I should be thinking I even know her up to 0.5 now. So we just still get to know who she is. Okay. I hope that in
But,
42 years I
and
can get
don't
to
let that be
point
discouragement.
two.
Let that instead, don't let that be a discouragement. Let that be a challenge and a point of excitement
Hmm.
to say, wow, if all I know of her is a 0.5, wow, there's a whole lot left to discover. And it just gets
Hmm.
better every day.
So, um, like I've talked about a couple of people. I've heard people talk about made the marriages work, and everybody to communication. And in time, even in workplace, leaders point to element in the work. Marriage was point communicant in
Mhm.
success. Marriage vision you have. If you can't communicate it, then it's never going to materialize. So, how essential is communication? How is it? I had a get ago from the Bahamas, and she said something like, "I need to understand that will not just read your mind. Communicated is never going to end." So, thoughts, communication.
Well, I'd say first, just remember communication is not something you do or don't do. You're always communicating. It's like the air around you.
Mhm.
It's always there. You're always sending messages. The question is, what messages are you sending? And can people understand the messages that they're receiving? Um, you know, that one of the joys of marriage, one of the joys really in any relationship, whether it is a family relationship or it's a work relationship, a professional relationship, or just a casual relationship with the neighbors. Um, Communication is always one of those things that comes with knowing people. It comes out of relationship. If you don't have
Mm-hmm.
relationship, then you're always saying things, but you have no idea of how it's being received. You have no idea if they're understanding what you're saying or if they understand what you're trying to communicate or what you're trying to present. You're always making assumptions because you don't know the other person to understand how they're receiving it. As relationships grow stronger, you begin to get this back and forth conversation that's going on. And in the
Mm-hmm.
back and forth, you're beginning to discover, am I communicating clearly? Am I communicating the right thing? Am I communicating the wrong thing? How is what I'm trying to express being received? Because you're getting that feedback, whether it's from your spouse or your neighbor or the people, your colleagues at work. And so relationship is such a key factor in communication. And so if we start talking about relationship, once again, we're back to some of the things we've discovered. Character. Well, there's a lot to be said about the difference between someone who's humble and someone who's prideful. A prideful character
Mm-hmm.
trait does not communicate well. Prideful character trait is always communicating their end, but not receiving much from anyone else. Humility, on the other hand, allows that communication to go back and forth. A character trait of transparency, in other words, just being who you are and letting people see who you are on your good days and on your bad days, that lends an awful lot towards communication. It gives other people the freedom to say, I'm hearing him say something, but that doesn't match who I know that he is. So they're able to then to
Mm-hmm.
discern he's not communicating it well. I know more by what he doesn't say than what he does say, which comes back to so much of communication. Yeah, it's verbal, it's nonverbal, it's a whole host of things. Uh, and so, yeah, communication is critical in relationships, whether it's a marital relationship, a professional relationship. But it all you can't just separate it and say do these five things and suddenly you're a good communicator. Um, it's much more dynamic to who we are in these interpersonal relationships. And so you can study communication and not work hard at relationship, and you'll never be a good communicator. You can work hard at relationship
Wow.
and never study communication, and you can be a great communicator. Now, that's not to say don't study communication principles, but it's to say communication in absence of relationship is usually not going to go very well.
Communication in the absence is not going to go very well. So for communicate relation, we can effectively communicate. Thank you so much. Jump into something. As happy to be an I'm Nigerian, happy to be here, and I've I moved across Africa for years, and I want to ask about the things you've experienced in Africa. That you see, I'm sure you know the challenges and everything that Africans, people trying to migrate those from. What make of this migration crisis Africa make first?
Yeah. First off, migration is a political term. Um, the emphasis on what's happening with migration is usually placed in a context of people leaving, people coming, and people trying to control
Mm-hmm.
that. Um, I say dig a little deeper and go a little farther back. First off, understand everybody moves. It's rare anymore to find someone who's still living in the same place where they were born. I suspect that
Mm-hmm.
everyone in the audience today is not where they started from. If you're probably
mm,
not in the community in which you were born, you moved, your parents moved, you moved to go to school, you moved to take a new job, you moved, and all of those movements were normal, natural, appropriate. Uh, why did you go to
mhm,
school in another town? Well, it's because it's where the school was. Why are you working the job you're working? Because there wasn't a job back where I was before. Well, why are you doing those things? Well, because I want to take care of my family. I want to have a better life. The world is on the move. And so, first off, when you say migration, you might as well just say human beings, because every human being is on the move. And so Africa's on the move just like the rest of the world is on the move. People are moving from rural to urban context. They're then moving from one urban context to another to go to school or to get work. Oftentimes they're moving off the continent and moving into global context. Africans aren't the only ones doing that. Everybody in the world is doing that. Sure, you can find places where people aren't moving, but they're the exception, not the norm. Um, so now we back up and we ask, why do people move? Is that a good
mhm,
thing or is that a bad
mhm,
thing? Well, the vast majority of people move for good reasons. We often say statistically, over 80% of all movement in the world is illegal. That means you went from one place to another, you bought an airplane ticket, you had a visa, you were invited to go to school, you interviewed and were employed for a job. The people who hired you are happy you're there. You're happy to be there. It's all good. And honestly, that is the vast majority of all movement. We do have those situations where people get pushed out. They're not moving because they wanted to, but they're moving because they had to. Uh, that gets an awful lot of the press. If you turn on the news today, you'll find a lot of stories about migration and really hard, difficult situations. Uh, but that's a small percentage of all that's happening in the world. It doesn't
mhm,
mean it's not important,
mhm,
and it doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve attention. But migration is so much bigger picture than all of that. In Africa itself, a lot of people are moving for a lot of good reasons, and it's good for them. It's good for their family back home. It's good for the places where they're going. We spend a lot of time looking at migration between Africa and Europe, and let's face it, Europe needs immigrants. Uh, if Europe is an aging continent, and people are not having children, and they are quickly losing the capacity to do all the work that needs to be done. Read a statistic the other day that Germany needs 1 million immigrants a year just to keep everything running. So moving is a good thing. It can be a good thing. It should be a good thing. The challenge is just the politics and the stuff that goes on around it. And so, what we encourage people to do is be in that 80%. If you're going to go somewhere legally. If you're going to do something, do it right. Uh, do it in a way to where when you get there, you can still be there in 10 years. Do it in a way to where you don't have to look back and have regrets about how you did it. Uh, Now, to the people who get caught up in things and it's not their choice, and I tell people, you may have made the choice to step in the river. That first step may have been your choice, but once the current catches you, it can take you a lot of places you don't want to go. That's not your fault. It was a foolish choice on the front end, but where you are today has so much more to do with the currents of this world and the circumstances. We need to give attention to that. We need to give compassion to that. We need to find ways to help people in those kinds of contexts. Some of that is to tell them don't get in the water. There's other places to go swimming. Don't go swimming here. This one's too dangerous. Sometimes it's a matter of throwing them a lifeline and helping them to get out of the river. And then sometimes it's a matter of helping them to survive wherever they land. Uh, and so it's a pretty complicated thing. But for the most part, and I would argue probably for most of the people listening to this, they would say, moving has been a good thing. It's been good for me. It's been good for my family. And the people that's around me today, they're happy I'm here. And So I like to try to get the focus back on the big picture sometimes so that it's not so dire and so gloomy when you talk about it.
I feel like try to understand the immigrant experts, immigrants and experts. For example, you just talked about 80% of immigrants, so only about
Mm-hmm.
20% or even less than that is so from Turkey to Nigeria on
Mm-hmm.
from the US to Nigeria it moves from France to J to Mauritius. They are caught.
Mm-hmm.
And why when someone moves from Nigeria to Turkey, France, Senegal to France, or job is Nigeria to countries, they are as parents.
Mm-hmm.
People start moving to the supposed forced superpower countries. Is that because I'm trying to understand where another
It's one of the reasons why I disliked labels, because everyone has a different definition for a label. My wife and I were having this exact same conversation this morning. Everyone is on the move, or most everyone is on the move. Perhaps my grandparents are not on the move, but most everyone else is on the move. So what that means is that you're an immigrant. If you spell it with an I, you're someone who's coming in the country. If you spell it with an E, you're someone who is leaving the country. But everyone on the move is a migrant. Okay.
Mhm,
Then we have this word expat. And when we talk about expats, we go, well, what makes a difference between an expat and an immigrant? Every expat is an immigrant. I mean, they're on the move. So what makes an expat different from an immigrant? And I think much of it has to do with culture. And culture takes these terms and they add value to them. And so my wife was sharing this morning, if you're an expat, we put a positive connotation on that. An expat is
mhm,
someone who left their country, they went to another country, they didn't surrender who they were in their first country, they've gone to another country and they're contributing. And so when people say expat, it generally has a positive connotation to it. When they say immigrant, it usually has a negative connotation to it because the first thing they think of are illegal immigrants or irregular
mhm,
immigrants. They think of people
mhm,
who are here but they're not necessarily contributing. And so that's a social distinction that comes with the terminology, which is one of the reasons why I don't necessarily care for the terms of either immigrant or expat, because the moment you use that term, you start categorizing people into a particular box. And George, you're very correct. What's the difference between a Canadian who moves to, let's say, Senegal and a Senegalese person who moves to Canada? The Canadian
mhm,
person went to Senegal to study foreign affairs at the university, and he's an expat. The Senegalese student went to Canada to study medicine. Is that individual not an expat also? Or are they just an immigrant?
mhm,
Well, the truth of the matter is they're both university students who took opportunity that was given to them to go learn how to be better at who they are and to be a contribution to their society. And there's no value differential between the two at all. It's just if you use one term, it brings one thought. If you use the other term, it brings another. So, what I encourage people to do, and I encourage those who are listening, let's work hard to get away from these terms. Or if we use them, let's be real careful to make sure we don't use them to categorize people into into boxes that is not honest or fair about those people. You can't escape the term expat. You cannot escape the term immigrant. If you're going to have a conversation in today's world, you have to use those terms. But just make sure that when you use those terms, you're clear to define what you mean by them. And in so doing, you contribute to helping to clear the air a little bit about that.
I asked this question because people consider me and why, and I'm positively and I'm positive that I'm committed to, and I'm 100% sure that six of the US have now the immigrant statistics are there to back it up around the most educated or people in us. So,
Mm-hmm.
and all of these people, they have jobs, they have families, they have two, three jobs in that they live legally there, contribute to the success of the of the country. The same in the UK, us and immigrants. That is very derogatory to derogatory, just like you said, negative. I see a large community of Americans in Nigeria, and they tell them to are experts. Experts at what? The same things we're doing in your country.
Uh,
That is
well,
very derogatory, demeaning. If we all are immigrants, if we all are
mhm.
experts, then we all contribute positively. I don't even know. I'm sorry to say, contribute positively to the area because I'm sorry to say who coming from other countries to Nigeria or come there to take. They work for big corporations that come and go back to build their countries. So I don't
Mhm.
even know if I say they contribute positively to the country. We, wherever we contribute very positively where we're living. So it's very important that it's things that as long as you're on the move, as long as you're contributing, you are an expert. Where you immigrate, using the word immigrant is used upon, used on. I very good that are
Yeah.
refugees. That so.
Well, we come back to this basic principle, George. We hear people use terms and we apply meaning to the terms that they're using. Oftentimes, they don't understand the meaning to the terms that they're using,
Mhm.
but we're hearing them use those terms. We apply the meaning to those terms, and then we base a judgment on that person based on our applied meaning to that term. So it's a two-way street. On
Mhm.
the one hand, we, you, I, the listening audience, we have to recognize that terms are being used that have they get meanings applied to them by our culture, and we disagree with the meanings that are applied to those terms. Okay. But we have to be careful that when we sit across the table from someone, if we do not have a relationship with that person and we hear them use that term, we suddenly apply the meaning of that term to their intent, and we assume they intend that meaning to be there. But once you get to meet that person, you realize if you had this very same conversation with them, they would say, I have never even thought about that. I've never processed how that term might come across in a way that is demeaning or derogatory to you. And they would say, I'm sorry. Why? Because when you get across the table from people, you find out they're human beings, they're people. Generally, they're good people. Generally, they have compassion. The typical person, now you can always find the exception, but the typical person who goes to Nigeria, they're not in Nigeria because they hate Nigeria. They had other options. They could have done other things. They're in Nigeria because they chose to be in Nigeria. Why do they choose to be in Nigeria? Well, they choose to be in Nigeria because they like Nigeria. They enjoy the culture, they enjoy the people, they enjoy the context of Nigeria. When we go to Morocco, it's interesting because we're Americans in Morocco, and Morocco loves having us there because they know that when we come, we will rent an apartment, we will drive a car, we will buy groceries, we will pay all the taxes and
Mm,
fees that are necessary to have our residency permit. And they see us as a source of income in too. Now, if we were bad people, they would make us leave in a heartbeat. But they take the time to
mm,
talk to us when we come in, and they determine you are not a bad person, character, and therefore they say, we are happy to have you in our country. And so the challenge of the stereotyping of people occurs on both sides of the spectrum. And so we always have to be careful. Doesn't matter what country we're in. You're a Nigerian in Turkey. I'm an American in Morocco. Your audience is a audience of moving people, which means they're always in somebody else's host country. And so we always have to make sure that while we are very careful to evaluate the context where we understand cultural usage of terms and the meanings that get applied to them. We can have our opinions about them, and we can dislike them, and we can do our best to change that. We just always have to remember that the person sitting across the table from us may not fit in that box. They're just a person who's using a term because it's a common, normal, natural term. And relationship is how you overcome that. And so, in the setting with them, get to know. That's why I say get to know your neighbor. When you get to know your neighbor, they stop being an immigrant, they become a human being. When you get to know your neighbor, they
mhm.
stop being a refugee, they become a person who's hurting. When you get to know your neighbor, they stop being someone who crossed over illegally, and they become a family, a husband, a wife, a child. They become real people with real needs,
Mhm.
and so that it's not the answer to everything, but it sure does help in a lot of situations, just to get to know the people around you.
Great. I'm going to take two more questions because we're running for
Okay.
wonderful conversation, really more than I did expect. I'm just going to take two questions. Like I said, I know you've traveled around seven countries and continents in the world, and I know you've seen, heard wars, you've seen wars, wars, those things. And then there's the war between Gaza
Mhm.
and the Palestinians. War constantly. Where there's war, I was talking to someone 2 weeks ago, and I was asking the person, "What's your plan?" And the person was like, "No, leave Turkey." He said, "I believe there's going to be war in Turkey as soon as possible." The strategic look at Turkey means there's going to be involved in the war. Okay, that's what I said. I don't think there's going to be, but there are crises everywhere. But I have a question: do you think that the crises in Africa receive the same as the crises in Europe? With the crises in when they happen, made it like it's a global crisis. Get it
Mhm.
if you're in trouble. But someone posted on Facebook and was like, the whole world has got to come in Africa. Those everything, it was not like I'm no, I understand people there. They're paying. But I did ask the person, are you sure saying this because your mother ever posted or said something about in Congo, the crisis? places.
Hmm.
Because I don't think that this crisis all the same attention. Do you think the crisis in Africa receive the same global attention?
Well, once again, I think it's a great question. When you say attention, my first thought is attention by who? If we say
Okay.
global attention, we're still asking the question, attention by who? If you're sitting next to a television in America or in Europe, Ukraine is going to get a lot more attention than anything that's happening in Africa. If you're sitting next to a
Mhm.
television set in Mali or in Bamako or Dakar or Abidjan, what's happening in Africa is going to get more attention oftentimes than what's happening up in Europe. If you're sitting in India or in Asia, well, what's happening there is going to get a lot more attention. So first off, attention. The people who put stories out are the people who they're basically selling the stories. What happens on the news, the reason why you see it is because whoever is running that news channel, whoever's writing that newspaper, whoever's running that website, whoever is putting that on the social media site, they want people to see it. There's an advantage to them if people buy their newspaper, see those ads on Facebook, sign up for their news coverage, and so they only produce that which their audience wants to hear. And so it's always been amazing to me when something will happen in Africa, and Africa has been reporting it for 2 weeks, and then they'll report it in the United States like it happened yesterday. And I'm going, guys, that's old news. That happened 2 weeks ago. And yet, and the one I remember the
Mhm.
most was when all the girls were kidnapped there in northern Nigeria in Chibok. And that had been happening for a month before it was ever reported in the US. And when it was reported in the US, you would have thought it happened yesterday. And I'm having to go, people, that happened a month ago. But see, it never did rise to a level to where the US stations thought it was important enough or would make them enough money or whatever to report it. The news today is so biased, and it's all biased towards the advantage to the person telling the story. So, if your question is, does Africa get news coverage like everyone else? The answer is obviously no, because that doesn't sell papers anywhere. That doesn't get clicks on social media like it does in other places. Now, if you have family in Cameroon, you're going to be talking about it. If your brother or sister lives in the Congo, that's high on your radar. If you got friends in northern Mali, you're paying attention to what's going on. You're looking for that. But the rest of the world didn't. And unfortunately, that's the nature of the news in the world, which is why the news has become so unreliable today. And I encourage people, we travel a lot, we see a lot, we learn to try very hard not to watch the news because it's so biased. It will cause you to become a biased person. It will fill you with only
Mhm.
one side of an equation. Now, that doesn't mean you need to live your life with living in a cave completely separated from what's happening in the world. But I would encourage you,
Mhm.
it's now much more responsible. We carry much higher responsibility that when you hear something, that you listen to news sources of other opinions to gain a broader context of what's happening. So if you're hearing about something happening in Africa, yeah, you may listen to a Western news source, but then you need to go and you need to listen to a Middle Eastern and Arab news source. Then you need to go listen to an African news source. Then you need to actually tune in and listen to a local news source of what's happening in that individual country. And you say, well, that's too much work. I don't have time to do all of that. And I want to say, yeah, staying informed in a global world today is a lot of work. But if we took half the time that we
Mhm.
spend clicking on videos on social media and just did a little search to find out what's really happening in the world, we'd be much better informed people. But I
Mm.
agree with you completely that it's very disheartening when things are happening in Africa and it gets such little attention, and they're atrocious things, they're horrific things, and then something happens somewhere else that can't even compare to what's going on in Africa, and it seems to get all the attention. That's frustrating for me as well.
It's been personal. It's been one of that, that it's that in certain parts of the world important that the world. For me, I might be wrong, or you know, in the words of prophet, either to be wars, all just one nation that justified it. So I hope if they are so important to global, I think the crisis and the wars in the same mentioned regard where human beings will feel pain, mothers lose husbands in Africa, just the same wives and husbands lose husbands in Ukraine, in Ukraine. And this question that I'm asked today, like I said, it's been a wonderful conversation. And thank you so much for. Do you think that the crisis that we see, do you think that peace real? Do you think that do you think there's a possibility that we're going to have someday that there's going to be a decade, 2 decades where someone will say in the past 2 decades we've not had the crisis have been, there's been. Do you,
George, when we were at the beginning of this conversation in the introduction, I told your audience that I had been a pastor in the United States for 30 years before we came to work in Africa and around the Mediterranean. I spend an awful lot of my time among people of faith. I spend my time with people who are Christian. I spend my time with people who are Muslim, people of faith who have a belief in God and have a trust that there is a power that is higher and bigger than anything happening in this world. If you take a close look at this world, this world's pretty messed up. We've got a lot of political divisions. We've got all kinds of economic divisions. There's suffering that is happening everywhere. Uh, it's always been that way. The only difference between today and 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, is one, there's a lot more people, so it affects a lot more people. Every time the world's population doubles, the suffering also doubles. Just a number of people hurting.
mm,
And then two, we know about it because we do see things on the media. Now, granted, as we've talked about, it gets biased and it gets segmented, and you don't get to see all the hurting and suffering, and it gets skewed. But the truth of the matter is, there's hurting and suffering around the world. And as long as there are people who do not have good character leading things in this world, we're going to have conflict and we're going to have all kinds of bad things happening. Uh, it's always been that way. As long as mankind is on this earth, it'll probably always be that way. We could hope it would get better, but oftentimes those hopes are frustrated and it doesn't get better. But the common thread that runs through people of faith is that there is a God who has character. He is righteous. He is just. He is compassionate. He does care about people, and he cares about what's happening in this world, and that he is in control, and that he can change the hearts of men, and that he can dictate and direct how circumstances play out. Now, he's certainly one who gives us the ability to make personal choice, and we have to live with the consequences of that. whether it's as an individual or leaders in a nation. But we put our hope in the one that's higher than this world. Will there be peace on this earth? I don't know. I hope so. I wish so. I pray so. Uh, but could I sit here and say, yeah, in 20 years there'll be peace on this earth? Uh, Past history does not encourage me that that's going to happen. However, can I say this? Can each individual person, people listening to this conversation, can you have peace in your life? Can you have peace in your heart, even in the midst of terrible things going on in this world? I think the testimony of millions and millions of people of faith around the world would be absolutely. You can find peace. You can have peace in your heart. You can have peace in your life. You can have peace in your family, even if everything around you is falling apart. And even if no one in the world knows about it or cares, you can find a place of peace, and that's found in your faith in God. And so I would not be honest or transparent if I didn't express that to your audience. I'm a man who have dedicated my life to helping people understand their faith and understand the God who cares about them and loves them and gave himself for them. And so, is there going to be peace in the world? I don't know. Can there be peace in your heart? Absolutely.
Wow. Wow. It's in the other way, so that you have to be honest. So, but in this is especially homes in our families with God. So I just want to say
Mm.
thank you and thank you much. It's been a conversation that I've had, and I know a lot of people are. So thank you, and joined us today. It's been wonderful. Answers have been very, very informative, inspirational, and transformative. Thank you so much. I look forward to person in seeing you in Turkey, hosting you anytime that you're able to come to. Thank you so much, and our wonderful to Matt Teresa.
Thank you, my friend. It's been a pleasure.
Bye. I'll see you next weekend. Thank you so much, and goodbye to. Thank you, sir.
Bye bye.